Liu Mixuan and Chen Ruhong arrived in Japan with nothing but ambition in their hearts and dreams in their eyes. But what began as a journey of hope ended in one of the nation's darkest mysteries: two young women found stuffed into suitcases in the depths of a silent forest, and a killer who vanished before justice could be served. Liu Mixuan had always been the kind of student who carried quiet determination in her eyes. Born in a modest town in Fujian, she had grown up sketching temple roofs and village markets. With a cheap pencil her father bought at the corner shop, her love for art blossomed quickly. And when she received an opportunity to study art history in Japan, her entire family celebrated with tears of pride. She promised them that she would not waste a single day. On the other hand, Chen Ruhong came from a more urban background in Guangdong. Her parents owned a small electronics shop, and she had grown up fascinated with circuits and computer screens. She was sharp, ambitious, and sometimes impatient. But she believed that the future belonged to people like her who understood technology. Both women had never met before the exchange program, yet fate pulled them into each other's lives when they were assigned to share an apartment in Tokyo. The friendship between Mixuan and Ruhong blossomed in the way strong bonds often do, slowly at first, then all at once. They laughed at the same television shows, shared bowls of noodles when money was short, and walked side by side through crowded streets filled with neon lights. They balanced each other out. Where Mixuan was calm, Ruhong was restless. Where Ruhong rushed ahead with bold plans, Mixuan slowed her down with patience. Soon it became hard to imagine one without the other. To their classmates, they seemed like sisters, always together during lectures, always whispering during exams, and always planning their next weekend adventure. Life abroad, however, was not without difficulties. The cost of living in Japan weighed heavily on them both. Mixuan picked up part-time shifts at a cafe that kept her up late at night, sometimes until her hands shook with exhaustion. Ruhong took tutoring jobs, teaching younger students mathematics, but even that was barely enough to cover rent, books, and food. Despite their hardships, they carried themselves with dignity. They would rather send cheerful photos to their families than admit how tight money really was. To their parents back home, they painted an image of carefree students thriving in a foreign country, hiding the reality of sleepless nights and quiet stress. Mixuan's love for art never wavered. Though her studies demanded more than she expected, she spent long hours in libraries, poring over thick volumes of Japanese paintings, sometimes sketching late into the night. She had a soft-spoken dream of becoming a museum curator, though she told almost no one, fearing it sounded unrealistic. Ruhong, meanwhile, immersed herself in computer engineering projects, constantly coding and experimenting. Yet over time, her friends noticed a shift. She grew more secretive, her phone always in her hand, her eyes distant. And sometimes she would leave the apartment without explaining where she was going, returning late at night. Mixuan sensed something was troubling her, but every time she asked, Ruhong brushed it off with a smile that never reached her eyes. Despite the unspoken tension, they still clung to their rituals: morning walks to the train station, Sunday cooking sessions where they tried to recreate flavors from home, and trips to secondhand bookstores where Mixuan searched for rare art catalogs while Ruhong flipped through technical manuals. Their bond was strong, but cracks were forming, quiet ones that neither wanted to acknowledge. What no one around them realized was that both women had already stepped unknowingly into the path of danger. Mixuan's late-night job at the cafe had introduced her to unfamiliar faces, some friendly, some unsettling. Ruhong's secretive outings hinted at connections she was too afraid to reveal. To outsiders, they looked like ordinary exchange students chasing their futures in a foreign land. Their professors admired their work ethic. Their classmates respected their intelligence. And their neighbors smiled at the sound of their laughter echoing from the small apartment they shared. The story of Liu Mixuan and Chen Ruhong began like so many tales of young ambition, with two women carrying the weight of their dreams on their shoulders. No one who saw them in those early months walking with umbrellas under Tokyo rain, giggling as they carried bags of groceries up their narrow staircase, or sitting shoulder to shoulder in university classrooms, could have imagined the chilling fate that awaited them. What seemed like a bright beginning was already being shadowed by something sinister. A presence lurked just outside their daily lives, watching, waiting, and planning. The happiness they clung to so fiercely was fragile, and it would not last. The disappearance of Leo McSuen and Chen Ruhong began quietly, like a ripple that no one noticed until it spread too far to ignore. It was early winter when they were last seen leaving their apartment in the evening, carrying small bags as though they were heading out for errands, or perhaps a casual outing. At first, no one paid much attention. Students at the university often disappeared for a few days, traveling to nearby cities or staying with friends. Odd. But as days turned into a week, the silence surrounding the two young women grew heavy. Their professors grew concerned when both missed lectures and failed to submit important assignments. Friends began to call their phones, but the devices were switched off. Even social media, where the girls often posted photos of their campus. Life went cold. The police were notified, and a missing persons investigation was quickly opened. Officers began by searching their small Tokyo apartment, where they found nothing unusual: 2 neatly made beds, stacks of books, and dishes left in the sink as though the women intended to return that night. There was no sign of a struggle. No broken locks or overturned furniture. It was as if they had simply walked out and vanished into the air. Their wallets and identification were gone, suggesting they had planned to step outside. But their laptops and heavier belongings remained untouched. Detectives traced their movements to a nearby train station. Surveillance footage showed the two friends walking together, dressed in coats and scarves, moving quickly as if they were late for something. McSuen carried a shopping bag while Ruhong checked her phone several times. The footage was clear, until they stepped onto the platform. After that, they disappeared into the stream of passengers. Investigators could not determine if they had boarded a train or met someone who was waiting for them. The trail seemed to end there. As police interviewed neighbors and classmates, a troubling picture began to form, several witnesses recalled. Seeing a man lingering around the apartment building in the weeks before the girls went missing. He was described as tall, with neatly combed hair and expensive clothes. Some neighbors said he had spoken with the women, often late at night. A store owner remembered him waiting outside the cafe where McSuen worked part-time. His name, they soon learned, was Shiro Tanabe, 33-year-old local businessman. At first glance, Tanabe seemed respectable. He owned a small import company and presented himself as a successful entrepreneur. But investigators digging into his background uncovered a different story. He had been accused of fraud in the past, cheating foreign students out of money by promising jobs and housing. Although charges never stuck, his name was tied to multiple scams. Rumors spread that he targeted vulnerable women, offering help, and then trapping them in dangerous situations. Friends of Ruhong provided more disturbing details. One classmate recalled seeing her in a cafe with Tanabe, looking uncomfortable as he leaned too close. Another said Ruhong had become withdrawn around the same time, avoiding gatherings and rarely answering messages. When questioned, some hinted that Ruhong may have been in a relationship with him, though no one could confirm how serious it was. For police, the connection between the missing women and Tanabe became a critical lead. Investigators tried to contact him, but Tanabe had already vanished. His office was locked, his phone disconnected, and his apartment abandoned. Inside, police found little more than a mattress and a few scattered papers. But one detail caught their attention: a receipt for duct tape and rope purchased just days before the women disappeared. News of the case spread quickly, capturing the attention of the public. Media outlets described the missing students as bright, hard-working young women who had come to Japan chasing their dreams. Their photos, 2 smiling faces framed by dark hair, were splashed across television screens and newspapers. Vigils were held at the university, where classmates lit candles and prayed for their safe return. As weeks passed without answers, fear began to spread among the community. Foreign students whispered about being followed at night. Parents called their children daily, begging them to stay safe. Authorities widened their search, combing through CCTV footage, interviewing cab drivers, checking hotels. But each lead ended in silence. It was as though the ground had swallowed the girls whole. The families of Mixuan and Ruhong flew in from China, desperate for answers. They stood in front of cameras, holding up photographs and pleading for information. To the investigation, pressuring police to find results, behind the scenes, detectives grew increasingly focused on one question: where had Tanabe gone? And what role had he played in the girl's sudden disappearance? The mystery deepened when one officer traced Tanabe's last known movements to a rental car company. Records showed he had rented a dark van on the very night the students were last seen at the train station. The van was returned 2 days later, cleaned, but with faint stains on the carpet in the back. Forensic tests were ordered, and while results were still pending, suspicion grew heavier by now. Whispers of a terrible possibility began to circulate among the investigators. The hope that Mixuan and Ruhong were simply hiding or had run away together was fading. The details surrounding their last days pointed to something darker. And as detectives pieced together the timeline, one truth became clear. Whatever happened to them, Shiro Tanabe was the key. The discovery came not from police but from two unsuspecting hikers who had wandered deep into the forests of Chichibu, a remote area west of Tokyo known for its mountains and quiet trails. It was late in the afternoon when the men noticed two large, battered suitcases half buried beneath fallen leaves and branches. At first they thought the cases were nothing more than abandoned luggage, perhaps dumped by careless travelers. But the strange weight of the objects when they tried to move them made their curiosity turn into dread. When one suitcase was finally unzipped, the grim truth revealed itself. Inside lay the lifeless body of a young woman, curled unnaturally, with bruises across her arms and face. The second suitcase held the same horror. Both contained the missing exchange students, Liu Mixuan and Chen Ruhong. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, police sealed off the forest, sirens echoing through the quiet mountains. Journalists rushed to the scene, cameras flashing, their reports broadcasting the shocking images of officers carrying the two weathered suitcases out of the woods. For weeks, the case had been one of hope and uncertainty. Now, hope was gone, replaced with grief and rage. Forensic investigators worked quickly, examining every detail of the scene. The suitcases themselves were old, scuffed at the edges, with faint smudges of dirt. Inside, the bodies showed clear signs of violence. Both women had bruises around their necks, the unmistakable evidence of strangulation. Their wrists bore faint rope marks, suggesting they had been restrained before their deaths. Around them were traces of duct tape, torn in pieces, as well as ashes from cigarettes pressed into the fabric lining of the cases. It appeared the killer had taken deliberate steps to conceal his crimes, though not enough to erase all traces. The forest floor revealed faint tire marks, likely from a van that had driven into the area at night. Investigators followed the tracks, which eventually led them to a nearby service road. Witnesses in the region recalled hearing an engine late one evening, long past the usual time hikers or campers would be passing through. None thought to report it until the bodies were found. Back in Tokyo, the families of Mixuan and Ruhong were devastated when police confirmed the identities. Both mothers collapsed in tears upon receiving the news, their cries broadcast across television screens in Japan and China. The two young women who had left their homes with dreams of education and new opportunities had been found discarded in a forest, treated as though their lives were meaningless. The tragedy sent shockwaves through both countries, with vigils held at the university in protests demanding justice for the victims. Detectives focused their attention on the suitcases themselves. The labels revealed they had been manufactured by a brand sold in local Tokyo shops. Surveillance teams scoured receipts from major retailers, hoping to find a purchase linked to their suspect. It was a painstaking process, but the discovery of a sales record at a department store matched with Tanabe's credit card purchases. This was enough to tie him directly to the crime scene, though his whereabouts remained unknown. Forensic analysis also strengthened the case. Hair fibers and partial fingerprints inside the suitcases matched both Tanabe and the two victims. Additionally, traces of blood too small to be seen at first glance were detected on the handles of the cases. This suggested the women had struggled, perhaps wounded during their capture. The evidence painted a chilling picture of careful preparation. The media framed the case as one of the most disturbing crimes in recent memory. Commentators debated how two bright students could fall prey to a predator in a foreign land. Opinion columns warned of the hidden dangers international students face when isolated and far from home. Others focused on the failures of law enforcement to catch Tanabe earlier, especially after his history of fraud and intimidation had been revealed. As the investigation progressed, detectives pieced together a likely timeline. The women had last been seen at the train station, possibly meeting Tanabe under the impression he was helping them with part-time work or housing. At some point that evening, they were overpowered, restrained, and taken away in the rental van. Their deaths likely occurred within hours. The disposal of their bodies in the forest showed both planning and familiarity with secluded areas. Tanabe had chosen a spot remote enough to avoid discovery, yet careless enough to leave behind tracks that would eventually lead back to him. What unsettled investigators most was not only the brutality of the crime but the sense of control it displayed. The killer had not acted in panic, but in deliberate calculation. Everything — the rope, the duct tape, the choice of suitcases, and the forest dump site — suggested a methodical mind. The horrifying discovery of McSuen and Ruhong's bodies marked a turning point in the investigation. No longer was it a case of missing students. It was now a double homicide, one that demanded answers and a swift capture of the man who had ended two young lives with such cruelty. Yet even as evidence stacked up against Shiro Tanabe, he remained nowhere to be found. Each clue only deepened the mystery of his disappearance. The suitcases had been found, the bodies identified, the method revealed, but the man at the center of it all had melted into the shadows. As the shock of the discovery spread through Japan and China, investigators knew they needed to retrace every step of Liu McSuen and Chen Ruhong's final weeks. Their lives, once viewed as simple routines of studying, working, and socializing, now appeared to hold darker layers hidden from those closest to them. Detectives began by carefully interviewing classmates and coworkers, piecing together fragments of conversations, hints of secrecy, and subtle changes in behavior that pointed toward something troubling beneath the surface. The focus soon shifted to Chen Ruhong. Friends recalled that in the months before her disappearance, she had seemed distracted and guarded, often glued to her phone, taking calls away from others, and slipping out of the apartment late at night. She stopped attending social gatherings and avoided questions about her sudden secrecy. At first, her behavior was dismissed as stress from studies or homesickness. But investigators quickly realized it connected to Shiro Tanabe. Evidence suggested that Ruhong had been involved with him in a relationship that was anything but ordinary. Bank records revealed small deposits into her account, inconsistent with her tutoring work. Tracing the sources of those deposits led investigators back to accounts linked to Tanabe. Witnesses also remembered seeing Ruhong at restaurants with him, sometimes looking anxious, other times visibly upset. Detectives suspected Tanabe had drawn her in with offers of money and promises of assistance, perhaps even manipulating her with the idea of stability in a foreign country. But when Ruhong tried to step away, his behavior turned controlling. Notes in her diary, later retrieved from her belongings, hinted at fear. One entry described her regret in trusting someone who smiled too easily but left shadows everywhere. The tragedy became more sinister when investigators realized that Liu McSuen had likely discovered her friends. Dangerous entanglement. Colleagues from the cafe where she worked told police that McSuen had confided in them about a man who frightened her. She had seen him waiting outside more than once and had urged her friend to be careful. In another instance, a classmate remembered her saying she felt like someone was following them home. These subtle warnings painted a picture of two young women caught in a web of control, one directly trapped, the other inadvertently dragged into the same danger simply by being loyal. As detectives dug deeper into Tanabe's background, the portrait of a predator became clearer. He had multiple fraud accusations linked to foreign students. In several cases, he had lured them into false job opportunities, charging fees for placement that never materialized. Some victims had even mentioned feeling intimidated when they tried to demand refunds. But none of these cases led to convictions. Tanabe always managed to vanish before legal consequences reached him, leaving only rumors and frustrated victims behind. This pattern of exploitation matched the timeline of Ruhong's relationship with him. He had used charm to gain her trust, money to tie her down, and threats to keep her silent. Inside Tanabe's abandoned car, forensic teams uncovered receipts for rope, duct tape, and gloves, items that matched the evidence found in the suitcases. Bloodstains in the trunk matched DNA from both victims, removing any doubt about his involvement. Alongside this, cigarette butts left in the vehicle carried his DNA, linking him firmly to the disposal site. Yet despite the mountain of evidence, Tanabe himself had disappeared. His empty apartment revealed only fragments of his life burned, photographs, discarded papers, and a single passport-sized photo of Ruhong with writing on the back that read, "Always mine." The revelation that Ruhong had been personally connected to the suspect complicated the emotional landscape of the case. The media quickly latched onto the story, speculating about how love, desperation, and control had all played roles in the tragedy. Public opinion was divided. Some blamed Ruhong for trusting him, while others condemned the environment that left vulnerable students exposed to predators. For McSuin's grieving family, the truth was even more painful. Their daughter had been dragged into a nightmare, not of her own making. Silenced because she chose loyalty to her friend, detectives reconstructed the likely events of the night. The two vanished. Ruhong may have agreed to meet Tanabe one last time, perhaps to end things. McSuin likely accompanied her, unwilling to let her friend face him alone. What followed was swift and brutal. An argument turned violent, control escalating into murder, and 2 lives extinguished in a calculated act of cruelty. The suitcases were not simply containers, but symbols of how disposable he viewed them, reducing human lives to luggage tossed into the wilderness. The case, now labeled a double homicide, was one of the most heavily covered in years. Pressure mounted on law enforcement to capture Tanabe, yet he continued to elude capture. Rumors swirled that he had ties to underground groups who could provide fake identities and safe houses. Others believed he had already fled Japan, starting over, under a new name in another country. For investigators, the unanswered question grew heavier. How could a man with such visible connections to the crime simply vanish, while carrying the weight of 2 young women's lives on his conscience? The more the trail unfolded, the clearer it became that the story was no longer just about to exchange students. It had become a reflection of power, manipulation, and the dangerous undercurrents running beneath ordinary appearances. Every piece of evidence pointed to a man who planned, who calculated, and who saw control as his right. And with each revelation, the urgency to capture him only grew sharper, as if justice itself was being held hostage by his disappearance. The nationwide search for Shiro Tanabe began with urgency, but as days turned into weeks, the frustration of investigators grew heavier. His face was plastered across wanted posters, broadcast endlessly on television, and circulated on social media feeds. Airports and seaports were placed under strict watch. Checkpoints dotted major highways leaving Tokyo, yet every attempt to capture him ended in dead ends. It was as if he had dissolved into the air, leaving only the horror of his crime behind. The families of Liu McSuin and Chen Ruhong, already broken by grief, watched helplessly as the man responsible for their daughters' deaths evaded justice. Their pleas for answers echoed through press conferences, each tearful request a reminder. Of the 2 lives cut short, detectives worked day and night to trace his last confirmed steps. Surveillance footage placed him in Osaka, entering a small business hotel under a false name just days after the bodies were found. The hotel clerk remembered him clearly, describing a man who seemed nervous, always checking the lobby windows, as if expecting pursuit. He stayed only 2 nights before vanishing again. Police later discovered he had paid with cash, leaving nothing traceable behind. From there, the trail went cold. Speculation filled the vacuum of silence. Some investigators believed Tanabe had strong ties to organized fraud rings, groups skilled in forging identities and moving people through underground networks. This could explain how he managed to slip away despite the intense dragnet. Others argued he might have ended his own life, overwhelmed by the weight of the investigation. Yet no body was ever found, and his name continued to linger like a shadow. Across Japan's most wanted lists, the public response grew fierce. Vigils turned into protests as students demanded greater protection for foreigners studying in Japan. Editorials in newspapers asked how someone with a criminal record of intimidation and scams had been allowed to move so freely for so long. Universities reviewed their support systems, promising tighter security and better resources for international students who often struggled in silence. The case had shifted from being a singular tragedy to a broader symbol of vulnerability, of how predators could thrive in the blind spots of society. For the investigators still on the case, the frustration was personal. Every officer could picture the battered suitcases carried from the forest, the evidence sealed in bags, the faces of the young women displayed at memorials. The trail of receipts, DNA, and abandoned belongings all told the same story. Tanabe was guilty. Yet proof of guilt without an arrest left the story unfinished, a wound that refused to close. His absence became almost haunting, as if he was watching from some hidden place, aware of the chaos he left behind. Years passed, and tips continued to trickle in. A sighting in Fukuoka, another in Sapporo, even a report from South Korea claiming a man with a striking resemblance was working under a false identity. Each lead was investigated, yet none confirmed. The absence of closure fed the legend of Tanabe. To some, he was a ghost who had mastered the art of vanishing. To others, he was still alive, living quietly in the very same city he once terrorized, blending into crowds with a new name and a different smile. For the families of Mixuan and Ruhong, the lack of justice was unbearable. Their daughters had been buried far from where their dreams ended, their lives reduced to cautionary tales. In a foreign land, at annual memorials, classmates gathered to light candles, speaking softly about their kindness, their ambition, and the way they had supported each other. Yet every gathering carried the same heavy silence, a silence built on unanswered questions, and the knowledge that the man responsible still had not faced punishment. The tragedy became etched into collective memory, retold in classrooms, documentaries, and late-night conversations about safety and trust. Was no longer just about two victims and their killer. It was about the fragility of life, the danger of hidden predators, the failure of systems meant to protect the vulnerable. For many, the image of those suitcases in the forest remained unbearable to recall, a symbol of how cruelty could erase futures in an instant. To this day, the name Shiro Tanabe remains on official lists, his face frozen in time on wanted posters, staring blankly as if mocking those who search for him. The murders of Liu Mixuan and Chen Ruhong stand as one of Japan's most chilling unsolved tragedies, a story where the ending never came. What began as a dream of opportunity in a foreign land ended in betrayal, violence, and silence. Until the man who vanished is found, the story of the two exchange students will remain an open wound, haunting both nations and reminding the world of justice denied,